Thank you very much for that welcome. I hope I can say something to live up to your expectations. As Barry said, I'm not a professional in the fields that apply to the development of Barangaroo, but I'm someone who has a feeling for the visual texture of great cities. And one of my favourite pastimes is wandering about in other people's cities, looking at the architecture and asking, what is this architecture doing for the people who live here? And the fact is, I think that we in Sydney are being very poorly served by architecture at the moment. One of the reasons, and I'll make a lot of enemies for saying this, but one of the reasons that architecture lets us down here is because it seems to be driven by economics rather than aesthetics. And because aesthetics sounds difficult and expensive even, and maybe it is in some cases, I think that architecture has lost its way of addressing people at street level. Sydney used to be a wonderful place to wander about in. Now, why do people want to build a hotel which looks like a bit of laboratory equipment in the water of Sydney Harbour when they've already pulled down the Australia Hotel, which was a genuinely ritzy, quality, great hotel, and Rose Street went with it. And we got Centrepoint. Now, Centrepoint has created a desert around it of wind and rain. There is no life in the streets. We're missing out. It's being taken away from us. It's not the place that we used to wander around in, and this is just not a nostalgia trip on my part. One of the wonderful walks in Sydney is around Farm Cove and the Botanic Gardens, around those wonderful curves on our harbour. They're continuous. Now, Barangaroo looks like an aircraft landing field. It doesn't belong to the fabric of Sydney. It's part of its industrial past, and sure, if you want to keep some relics of that, and there are plenty in inner Sydney, I'd like to see a respect not just for the values that have been expressed so far, but for the qualities that Sydney has and the things it can aspire to. Our natural gift of Sydney sandstone, for instance. I love that wall that goes around Farm Cove. I know it's artificial. I know it wasn't there in 1788. But why don't we continue to shape the harbour going around Barangaroo and give us a low sandstone wall that belongs to the people? It would balance Circular Quay, and it would remove some of the corporate anxieties that go into these kind of developments. People thinking, no, we can't do that, we can't afford that, we'll have to cut costs here. We're the people who lose. And our streets become soulless, empty, drafty spaces which are not people-friendly at all. You hardly see people walking around Sydney these days. If they're not going into the arcades, which are artificial creations in a way, they're not on the street. And I think that shopping malls, which seem to be planned for this development, are nothing compared to a plaza, a park, a square, with narrow streets leading into it, so that you suddenly open out the space. People are surprised and delighted to be in the sun with trees, plants, maybe some market stalls, people getting on with their work, all part of us. And I think that we risk with Barangaroo, unfortunately, a loss of that human scale that we all relate to and make our town part of us and a reflection of us. We lose that out to corporate interests. And I'm very distrustful of big developments which don't respect, say, things like the escarpment along Hickson Road, Again, Sydney sandstone, and really quite beautiful. Why isn't that reflected in this plan? Why aren't those curves of the bays and coves of Sydney that were experienced in 1788, why aren't they being reflected? Why aren't we looking after our harbour? I'm only here because of some loose remarks I made in a newspaper a couple of weeks ago to do with my exhibition. So now I'm having to defend my willful remarks. So I hope you'll forgive me.